Ladies and gentlemen, we are here at the Warsaw Uprising Museum, a special place dedicated to a major historical event and the greatest uprising in European history, namely the 1944 Uprising of Warsaw. This place is dedicated to honoring the great men and women who laid down their lives on the line to protect the freedom and independence of the great Polish nation. Joining us today is Dr. Mirosław Czado, an expert on the Warsaw Uprising Museum, giving us a guide on what it means to be in the Warsaw Uprising. So we know during the World War times, the army size of both sides of this aisle is drastically different. And what are the exact numbers of the sizes of the armies, the equipments, and how did Poland manage to survive so long after bombardment from the side with so much more army power behind it?
In March of
1944, the decision was made that Warsaw would not join Operation Tempest, meaning the city would not engage in any battles with the Germans within Warsaw. The operation was aimed at seizing control of cities and areas across Poland occupied by the Germans while they were preparing their defenses against the advancing Soviet army. Seeing the fate of the Home Army forces that had taken part in Operation Tempest, Chief Commander of the Home Army, General Tadeusz Ból-Komorowski, made the decision to prohibit military action within Warsaw. Due to that fact, Warsaw was not prepared for the uprising at all. At the time of the breakout of the uprising, only 12% of the insurgents were armed. That was because up until July 1944, every single weapon that had been seized was sent out to the eastern parts of Poland. Warsaw did not collect weaponry, as the presumption was not to start an uprising in the capital. The Warsaw unit of the Home Army counted about 50,000 soldiers, but only close to 35,000 joined the uprising. Meanwhile, the German forces were 16,000 strong, with that number growing to 32,000 over time. However, the main difference was in terms of the weaponry. German troops were fully armed, and these units had immense experience from battles on the eastern front line. Therefore, these were the best soldiers, familiar with the guns, and with a high morale. On the contrary, the Polish side, only 12% of them were armed. Their weapons were often homemade. Some weapons were seized from the German soldiers, some were dropped from airplanes, mostly during the uprising itself. Bottles filled with gasoline were used mainstream. People would even create makeshift launches for those gasoline bombs. Therefore, the size and quality of their weaponry was incomparable. The Germans even had air force on their side, as they controlled the airports. The Warsaw-Okęcie airport was used by the enemy forces as many as 120 times to drop bombs onto the capital. It is true that the uprising was supposed to last 3 days. The insurgents were waiting for the arrival of the Soviet military, who were located 20 kilometers east of Warsaw. The main aim of the uprising was to seize Warsaw for 12 hours prior to the Red Army entering the city. We have this saying in Poland, if you control the capital, you control the country. That is precisely why we wanted the Home Army to control Warsaw when the Red Army would enter the city.
Nam zależało na tym, żeby w momencie wejścia Armii Czerwonej Armia Krajowa, Polska Armia Podziemna kontrolowała miasto.
One of the guests who honored us by her presence is Mrs. Lumiła Niedbolska, veteran of the uprising. She served as a scout at the young age of 12, carrying out postal services that was crucial for the uprising. In the war-torn Warsaw during the 1940s, when communications is important but extremely difficult, her service not only brought written words and letters, but a glimmer of light in the darkest hours.
I volunteered in the committee and simply asked what was needed. In accordance with the old Scout rule, which says, do what is needed to be done, they told me, pass this message, go to the roof and look out for tanks. I would distribute newspapers, as even during the uprising newspapers were being made. The command would give out orders, but they would also publish the official gazette, like in any free city or country. In one of the houses destroyed by bombs, they were digging up people from the rubble, so I was asked to write down the names of the ones they dug up. That was the worst experience of the uprising for me, as I had to write down the names of the bodies they identified. As for the few that made it out alive, they were sent to the medical units. Once I went down to the basement to read a book. It was at that moment that the house was bombed. The whole building collapsed onto the basement, that me and some other people were inside at the time. It took a couple of hours for some people from the adjacent building to dig out a passage through the wall and get us out. At the very beginning of the uprising, right after the breakout, the enthusiasm among the people was outstanding, absolutely outstanding. The people were ecstatic that it was finally the time the Germans would finally be gone. Essentially, any other issue became irrelevant. You had to look for food, you looked for food. You had to look for shelter, you looked for shelter. We queued for the barricade. My sister passed through it, and as I began my walk, I heard an officer yelling from up above, "Stop!" But I didn't stop. It took my mother's piercing scream for me to immediately stop in my tracks. And right when I did, a tank missile hit the barricade right in front of me. It hit. I said okay and went on my merry way. Since the moment the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, that is June 22nd, 1941, until July 19th, 1944, which is right before the uprising, the Russians were bombing Warsaw. And that is something that is not talked about, because nobody even remembers it, even Warsaw citizens themselves. Bombs were dropping day and night. Once a bomb hit a rail car and killed a lot of people. One of them was my neighbor's teacher who had 2 daughters. Those 2 daughters' first communion was 2 days later. Instead of wearing the traditional white robes, they had to wear black to the ceremony.
There are hundreds upon hundreds of personal life stories that depicts the heroic yet tragic life during the Warsaw Uprising. The struggle between the Polish soldiers and the occupational force supposed to last for 3 days, but last for 63 instead. The bravery, the courage, and the resilience of the Polish freedom fighters later on would inspire the solidarity movement during the communist times and became a symbol in Polish culture. It is difficult to combat darkness. You can wait for light, you can look for the light, you can share the light, but the brave men and women of the Warsaw Uprising made the choice to shine. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee. See you next time on Poland Daily History.